fruits. But basically, each devil fruit was ranked by the following 4 categories, the first of which is power. And this is the typical way in which most fans will analyze devil fruits. This category is about pure raw combat and just how strong a fruit's abilities can make you. Now the next section is utility, and this is all about how beneficial a devil fruit can be for use in daily life. Because the thing we often get wrong when looking at the best devil fruits is automatically assuming the best means most powerful. It doesn't, and fruit that can completely change your day-to-day life are also well worthy of consideration when we're talking about the best, so that has its own category. And the third section is potential, which mainly exists to balance out the fruits in the series that were possessed by terrible wielders. So fruits with great potential power that we have no demonstrated evidence of. Because it's not the fruit's fault that they weren't used well, but this category also goes on to favor devil fruits that have demonstrated uses beyond their initial power granting. Like say the Gomu Gomu no Mi is a fruit that would do really well in the potential category because it has demonstrable evolution. And finally, we have my favorite category, which is detriments. This final section is designed to account for fruits that actively curse their users more than usual. Devil fruits that come with innate negative qualities that users need to overcome. So a high score in the detriment category means that a fruit has very few negative outcomes, whilst a low score in this category means that a fruit has major negative impacts on your lifestyle. And to be honest, this last category won't be too important for this list. It will be focused on a hell of a lot more in the worst devil fruit list, but I feel like it is important to account for because detriments almost never get taken into consideration. And so basically every fruit then gets assigned a score out of 10 for these 4 categories. Those are added up to a number out of 40, and then I converted that directly into a score out of 100 because that's a much nicer number to deal with and gives you a better overall impression. I mean, for example, saying that a fruit scored 90 out of 100 gives you a much better impression than saying, say, 36 out of 40, which is stupid. And just as a bit of an intro example of how the system works, one fruit you will not see on this list is the Guru Guru no Mi, and you might initially think that's a bit absurd because it is the strongest paramecia in existence, and you're right, so it satisfies one of our 4 categories. Meanwhile, its scores were not so great in the others, especially utility, because other than mass destruction, there's not a lot of day-to-day use with it, and it gets saddled with detriments such as being difficult to control and causing friendly damage. And in this case, it achieved a total score of 73.75 out of 100, and I did find at least 20 fruits who outdid it. More actually. But with that example out of the way, let us get into our top 20 results, commencing with, rather predictably, number 20, which will be the Horo Horo no Mi. So we are starting this list off with a very high mark because this fruit is far above average and a good all-rounder. In combat, it gets slapped with a solid 9 if just for the fact that it will make 99% of opponents immediately incapacitated and surrender. And if they don't, well, we have explosive ghosts to chuck at them for days, none of which can be impacted by any attack or defense in this world. In fact, at this moment, we don't even know if Haki affects these ghosts, which is pretty wild and insanely powerful. The utility category is also pretty damn crazy, as summoning an army of ghosts to do your bidding is a fine way to spend life, and indeed, a post-time skip Perona can even levitate, and yes, this is Perona, it's not an astral projection, although this fruit also lets you do that. The fruit really only loses points for not having a truly infinite amount of utility, and its potential is limited, given that it mostly involves features that exist on a different plane. And the only detriment I could really think of is that the user does have to leave their body vulnerable to access astral projection, but that's all. Otherwise, this is a great and incredible fruit to begin with. Now moving on to number 19, I'm going to say right here and now that Zoan fruits don't feature too heavily on this list, but one of the rare examples of a fruit that is simply too good to ignore is the Hito Hito no Mi Model Daibutsu. Because mythical Zoans are always something to take notice of, especially when they come with an innate shockwave ability that rivals attacks performed by the strongest paramecia fruit. And becoming a big old Buddha does come with some nice utility, because transforming into a giant allows you to do all sorts of things that a regular afro-clad human simply could not. However, I do think that being a giant hits a ceiling fairly soon. It does also have a higher score in potential because we've really only caught the briefest of glimpses of this thing's full power, and it may very well come with an aspect of mental enlightenment, being a Buddha and all. And as for detriments, turning into a giant is actually a pretty big detriment because it's much harder to control your movement in a society that is unapologetically designed for regular humans, and you would need to be very, very careful when you transform. I mean, for example, if you were to transform on a particular size ship, then the weight of the Golden Buddha might even sink it, so stuff like that is a consideration. But it's still a pretty great fruit, as is number 18, which will be the Magu Magu no Mi. And this is probably a good time to mention that fruits were sometimes tied in terms of overall score, and in that case the tie had to be broken simply by my personal opinion, which is why in this case the Magu Magu ranks higher than Sengoku's Hito Hito no Mi Model Daibutsu. But here we have the fabled devil fruit with the highest offensive power, so it gets a perfect 10 there, quite easily. Utility and potential both have an 8, and most of that comes from the fact that it is simply a Logia fruit. In terms of elemental elemental creation, Logia have a demonstrated ability to create more or less whatever they want out of their elements, which is pretty damn useful to say the least. But in this case, the Magu Magu does lose points because magma is a destructive element, which thus limits its utility and potential more than a friendly element would. Like for example, I'd rather live in a castle made of ice than a castle made of raging hot magma. And being a destructive element is also why it lost points for the detriment category. This fruit is a massive liability to everyone and everything around you. You would need to be so damn careful anytime you activate these powers, because one stray drop of magma can do untold harm. But with that said, still an undeniably great fruit, however, not the best. And a betterer fruit can be found in number 17 perhaps, with the Pera Pera no Mi, because this is a shockingly underrated fruit, and it mostly comes from the categories of utility and potential, which give the Pera Pera no Mi a perfect 10 out of 10 each. And this is because as a generation style paramecia with a very friendly substance being candy, a user of this fruit can make quite literally anything. And yes, that something needs to be made out of candy, but it can be as ornate or as mechanically sound as you need it to be. I mean, we've even seen a grand candy escalator conjured in the series, so the utility and potential of the Pera Pera no Mi is effectively infinite. Where this fruit does lose points is definitely power. Yes, it's quite strong, but only as much as the candy itself, or with an experienced user, only as strong as the haki imbued into the candy. It's not a fruit that grants you godlike levels of raw power on its own, and as for detriments, well, candy can be a pretty tricky thing, because obviously it's not hugely viable to use in any hot climates. At best, it gets all sticky and annoying, and at worst, it melts, making you constantly recreate all of the cool things that you've made. And just as a side note, let's hope that the tongue of Perispero is not part of the Pera Pera no Mi, because it very well might be. Now moving to number 16, we have the Ryu Ryu no Mi model Pteranodon, and I have to say this one really surprised me. If I was to make a list entirely based on unstructured opinion, I don't think I would even come close to considering this for the top 20. But under the criteria I set out, this one blew away all expectations. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that this fruit grants its user natural flight, which with utility, any fruit that grants natural flight was immediately given at least a score of 9, because flight is one of those truly life-changing abilities. Do not underestimate how amazing and how useful it is. But as an ancient Zoan, we're also very much at the top of the pecking order when it comes to power in terms of raw physical strength gained anyway, because there's a very simple strength hierarchy in this class, being basic Zoan, carnivorous Zoan, and then ancient Zoan being the strongest. Although above those are mythical Zoans, but they tend to be more magic and ability based rather than strength based. This fruit also scores pretty highly for detriments because there really aren't that many, other than drawing a lot of attention to yourself for, being a flying dinosaur. But I have to say, I also can't see a huge amount of potential in it either. I mean, yes, you can potentially awaken the fruit, but I really don't know how much further we can push it beyond what we've seen. However, what we've seen is still pretty damn cool.